Hey everyone. This is a part of a video series that I'm doing on acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT for short. And I rely really heavily in my work on ACT. It's an approach to therapy that's made up of 6 different components. And I made a video on the first 3 components. One for acceptance, it's in the name, right? And one for cognitive diffusion, and one for self. So if you're interested in learning more about ACT, I encourage you to check out those other videos if you haven't already. I was going to do a separate video for all 3 of the last components, but instead of making 3 separate videos, I thought I would just try to combine everything I know about those 3 components into one video. So in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about those 3 components, which are presence, values, and action. So let's start with presence. Presence is very simple. It really just means to have your attention, your awareness, your consciousness grounded in the present moment. The idea is that actually when we look at psychological studies, research studies that examine this kind of thing, we find that people who don't do well in terms of their mental and emotional health, they tend to get constantly pulled into the past or the future. It's kind of an oversimplification, but this idea that like when we're depressed, we're stuck ruminating on the past, and when we're anxious, we are sort of projecting our consciousness into the future, predicting, trying to anticipate what's going to come around the corner and possibly harm us, imagining worst case scenarios, overthinking things. And so really though, they find that people who are able to, it's not to say that we never should think about the past or the future. That's part of what it means to be human. We want to remember, we want to learn from the past, and we want to be able to plan and anticipate the future. We have to do that for practical reasons. However, the only place where life actually happens, when you really think about it, is in the present moment. The future never really arrives, as they say, except as the present moment. And the past is gone. It's just a memory. So this is where life happens, in the present. It's always now, in a sense. You're watching this video now. You remember things now. You think about the future, even in some sense, in the present moment. So realizing that though, we're always in the present moment already. Bring our attention to what is happening right here, right in this moment, our body, our breathing, who we're interacting with, what we're doing, really paying attention and being aware of that. It's, like I said, it's really simple in a way, but very challenging to do that. The mind is always sucking us into thought, into all kinds of stuff that our mind does. And whenever we're lost in thought, we're not really being present with what's right here. So the idea is to always bring it back to the present moment, to stay rooted and grounded here and now. And so how do we do this? Well, really, you just have to think about what are certain anchor points, certain triggers you can use to repeatedly bring you back to the present moment. People use all kinds of things. The most common thing is paying attention to the breathing, right? As an anchor, you could set aside time to meditate. 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes is fine for a good start, even for a long-term regular practice. Just deciding you're going to set aside that time just to pay attention to your breathing, and every time your mind wanders off, you bring it back. The breath doesn't work necessarily for everyone. In fact, some people, it kind of creates even more anxiety. So you can use alternative anchors. You can pay attention to your body as a whole. You can focus your attention on, let's say, just your feet. maybe even just your left foot. Right? This is something that ACT uses in a way because the breath can sometimes be a source of anxiety for people. It could be your hands. It could be deciding that, whenever you brush your teeth, you're not going to be thinking about what's next, what's coming up in the day. You're not even going to be thinking about making your cup of coffee. You're going to be thinking about just the sensation of the bristles on your tongue and your teeth, of the taste of the toothpaste, the sensation of the water, and what's happening right then and there. So you cultivate this habit of your mind is primarily focused on what's here and now. So that's presence. Next is values. So the idea with values, really what we're talking about is, what is it that is most important to you? What is it that truly matters? Not what you think should matter, not what your parents say should matter to you, or your boss or society, what you think ought to be important to you, but what just is deeply important to you. The idea why this is part of ACT is that, okay, so you come to therapy, and if you've seen the earlier videos, you know that it's not about getting rid of your unwanted thoughts and emotions. It's about changing your relationship to them. And so you practice accepting your symptoms of anxiety, your symptoms of depression. So you've done that. And now you're kind of trying to say, okay, well, if my whole goal of therapy is just to get rid of anxiety and depression, well, now what? I mean, is that the point of life, is to just not be depressed or anxious, to not suffer? What is all this in the service of? What is your life actually for? And then once you work at identifying what are your values, the things you really care about, that serves as a guide, a compass for setting the direction of your life. Then you work, and the therapy becomes oriented towards moving towards living a life that is aligned with your values, that embodies your values. And then if depression and anxiety want to come along for the ride, so be it, because we're practicing that attitude of acceptance toward it, if that makes sense. So you want to spend some time reflecting on what are your values, and when you live your life, when you look at your life as a whole, how you spend your time, the kind of decisions you make, do those actions and behaviors align with those values, right? And if not, chances are you're probably going to be more unhappy if you're living things that are contrary to what you care about or believe in, living someone else's values. Like, values can help to inform even what your goals are, right? You want to look at what your goals are now, and do those embody your true values? So, there's some ways you might have to experiment with in terms of how you might identify your values. People have kind of looked up online lists of values and cross off as many as you can, right? And get to the point where you only have maybe 4, 3, 2 values left on the list that you just can't let go of when you think about those words, what they mean to you. That's one way of just narrowing it down. And it's also important to clarify, right? It's a little tricky when we think about values. On the one hand, you might think of family. A lot of people name family as a value. Sure, family is important to many of us. But how is it that you actually want to show up with your family, let's say? What are the qualities that you want to bring to those relationships? That's a little bit more in line with what we're talking about, rather than the generic, here's my value of family. So in other words, maybe you want to relate to your family in a kind or a compassionate way. Maybe you want to be more present with your family. Maybe you want to be more generous or honest with your family, right? So those would be kind of a little bit more thinking concretely about what those values are. What are the qualities? Other exercises that I've heard are imagining yourself at your own funeral, right? Fast forwarding and trying to get a sense of what do you want your legacy to be? What do you want people to have said about you once your life is over? That can be a kind of way of trying to identify some of those values and what you want your life to mean and what's important to you. So that's really values in a nutshell. The third component is action. And really, I think what this really highlights is just the fact that all of this, what we're talking about, the different components of ACT, psychotherapy, unless we are taking action, if we're just talking about it and thinking about it, it's probably not going to make a huge difference in our lives. At the end of the day, we need to actually act. And if we're not acting, then we're probably going to be feeling held back in our lives. Nothing's going to actually change. So we want to, think about, okay, what kind of actions do I need to take that are in alignment with my values? And how can you take consistent action in that sense? This is kind of talked about Stephen Hayes, the originator of ACT. I've done some reading around him, and I like what he says. It's in alignment with a lot of what I tend to teach in terms of my interest in mindfulness and cultivating habits, is really just the whole idea of baby steps, right? So like he used the example in his book, A Liberated Mind, of like, if you want to exercise more, let's say, instead of making it really challenging for yourself and saying, well, I'm going to go to the gym for an hour, 2 hours a day, even if you manage to somehow pull that off for a month or two, it's probably not going to be sustainable. I mean, in some cases it might be, right? It becomes life transforming for you, but a lot of people don't have the time, the energy, the motivation. Stephen Hayes kind of indicates that like it's better to have smaller, more manageable steps we can take towards that goal that are going to be more sustainable, right? A little bit of action consistently over a long period of time is going to have more of an impact than if you only exercised for an hour every day for a month, but then you just said, to hell with it, I can't keep up with it. And then you go back to not exercising at all. So, he uses examples of like, maybe it's just doing 10 push-ups before bed or first thing in the morning. Maybe he talks about how when he goes to a grocery store, he'll just take some milk jugs or his cart and just do curls. And like, people look at him funny and he doesn't care. It's just his way of incorporating exercise into his day in those kind of clever but very simple ways. So yeah, ask yourself as you're thinking about wanting to make changes in your life, what are the smallest possible avenues in? What's the way in? Openings, little doors, sometimes the time boxing, right? Set a timer. You can never find time to read or exercise or meditate. Set a time for 10 minutes. Right? Maybe you can push it if you have more, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, right? But tell yourself, because if you say, I'm going to sit down and, do this project and however long it takes or devote my whole night to it, that's a lot, right? But if we say, I'm just going to do this for 30 minutes, I'm just going to do it for 10 minutes, and then I'm going to give myself permission not to do it. That's a much better way of going about it to get started. Right? So that's really it in a nutshell. Presence, values, action. I hope this video was helpful to you, and if so, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.